Hey there. Welcome to the lecture on personality development, part two. In this lecture, we're going to go over some personality theorists such as Carl Rogers, Carl Gustav Jung, and Gordon Allport. Let's begin. So, Carl Rogers is one of my heroes in psychology. He came up with a set of ideas that were very contrary to popular thought, or I should say, popular psychological thought in his time. In his time, a lot of people took a Freudian-based approach for not just understanding the person and personality, but also how to proceed in terms of therapy, referred to as psychoanalysis. Carl Rogers comes up with a completely different conceptualization of the person. He believed that people were not a product of their personality development. Think about those 5 stages of psychosexual theory that we talked about in the last lecture. Freud basically said that growing up from infancy through adolescence determines your personality, and that basically determines all of your behavior going forward. Well, Rogers took a different approach. He didn't, even though he believed that we have this thing called an ego, he didn't think it was all that powerful. In fact, if you have problems, Rogers didn't think it has something to do with your ego development and you had to go into therapy and work out things by visiting past experiences to see how you develop these defense mechanisms. No, he took a completely different approach. He thought that people had an innate need to express themselves and a strong desire to be genuine. This is the cornerstone of his theory of personality, that we really yearn to be genuine and we want to express ourselves. And this is very contrary to popular psychological thought at the time. Rogers comes out with this book On Becoming a Person in 1942, and it was a very radical set of ideas. It went in stark contrast to psychological thought in his time. Because back in the early 40s, US society was highly conformistic. It was in vogue to conform and to be like everyone else. And Rogers was the first person to see the dangers of conformity, that if we conform so much to norms, to expectations of others, we're going to deny our genuine selves, and that can lead us into problems. So Rogers' view of personality is a bit abstract, and actually it's a lot more complex than Freud's approach to personality. But at this level, let me say that the key word here is congruence. That is a major term in Rogerian theory. And broadly speaking, Rogers says that we can conceptualize personality by looking at the congruence or lack of congruence between the ideal and the actual within the person. Now, that's pretty abstract. What do you mean, the ideal and the actual within the person? Well, it comes down to the extent that a person is aware of themselves and the extent that they could truly and genuinely express themselves. Because we live in a society, or we live in the world, where social pressures and social expectations definitely have some influence with respect to our sense of self and this thing that Rogers calls the phenomenal field that I'll talk about in a moment. So if you are following me, then you should understand that Rogers conceptualizes personality as a matter of congruence between the ideal and actual realities that we face. And we see this in two ways. First, there is a sense of congruence between the self and the organism. You might be thinking, well, why use the word organism? Well, another word for organism is person. But person gives off the vibe of things being static. Where if you think about it, people are always changing. We are constantly evolving. And his initial title was Organismic Theory of Personality, but that just didn't roll off the tongue very well. So he makes reference to the person as an organism and that the person is always constantly changing. Anyway, getting back to the concept of congruence, we have a sense of self, which is a small part of the phenomenal field that we'll talk about pretty soon. But who are you? Do you have a sense of awareness, a reference to me, to I, mine? This is something that develops in life, and we have some kind of idea as to who we are as individuals, a sense of self. So this slide is representing one's awareness of their sense of self based in relation to the sum of all of one's experiences. All of our experiences definitely inform us as to who we are as John Major, the person, or my sense of self, John Major. So if there is great congruence, if the sum of all of our experiences inform us as to who we are, we're aware of who we are, and we can express who we are, then this level of self-acceptance fosters a healthy and mature personality. This is how we should conceptualize personality, according to Rogers. However, that's not always the case, and the people he treated in psychotherapy tended to have a great level of incongruence. You can see in this slide a separation between that sense of self and the organism. And this would indicate an immature and underdeveloped personality. So when the person cannot be true to oneself, if they cannot accept themselves, they're going to deny all their experiences that have informed them as to who they are. And if you think about people who are overly concerned about keeping up with appearances and being phony so they can please other people, what they're really doing essentially is denying their sense of true self. And Rogers was treating a lot of people who experienced this, who came to see him for psychotherapy. And this, in time, kind of gave birth to his theory of personality. So we have a sense of congruence between the self and the organism. In other words, my own sense of self in relation to all my experiences in life. Do I have a sense of congruence? Have I accepted who I am? Am I honest to myself? That's one level of congruence between the ideal and the actual. The actual here would be represented as the organism. In other words, all of our experiences, those are real things. Then we have a sense of the ideal, which is a sense of self. Do I have a healthy understanding of who I am? Second, there is a sense of congruence between internal and external realities. Enter the concept of phenomenal field. In other words, all of our experiences give birth to our perceptions. And it's within this field, within our perceptions, we have a perception of one's sense of self. So self is actually a part of the phenomenal field, but it's not limited. The phenomenal field has to do with all of our perceptions based on all of our experiences in life. The point of this slide is, do all of our perceptions based on our experiences overlap, or are they congruent with external reality? Ultimately, our perceptions inform our sense of self. And if you study this slide and the previous slide and you think about it, it's no doubt that a sense of self is to some extent based in relation to our external realities, namely social pressures and social expectations. So congruence between the ideal and the actual occurs on two levels. We have it quite subjectively or quite internally because we have a sense of self, which is an internal concept, and we have the sum of all of our experiences, which is also a subjective quality. So congruence within the person and a sense of congruence externally. How do those subjective experiences of our phenomenal field, in other words, our perceptions, relate to objective realities, things outside ourselves? If we have a sense of congruence on these two levels, then we have a healthy sense of personality. This is the whole point of what Rogers was trying to say, that this is perhaps a better way of conceptualizing personality. And it was so popular and so transformative in the field that it gave birth to the humanistic paradigm for understanding personality, the humanistic approach to engaging in psychotherapy, and the creation of the profession known as counseling. Counseling as a profession is different from psychotherapy. And we'll maybe talk a little bit about psychotherapy later on in this course. But the point here is that it is so strong, these ideas, that it's a very effective tool to help people who come in for help when they have psychological problems. Okay, moving on. Let's talk about Carl Jung's approach to personality. There's good news and there's bad news. The bad news is Jung's approach to personality is way more complex than Sigmund Freud's. But the good news is this should be much easier to understand because we already talked about Freud. Now, Jung's analytic theory of personality, is what it's referred to as, consists of many components. We have the four functions that we talked about earlier when we were talking about emotions. Jung believed that there are four functions of the mind, not the brain, but the mind, how we process information. And we process information with respect to thinking or rational thought process, feeling, which is the subjective interpretation of ideas, sensing, the messages we get from our senses, and intuiting, the subconscious processing of information. Now, the individual varies based on the extent that they engage in these four functions. Some people are more thinking oriented than feeling oriented, and others are a bit more feeling oriented than thinking oriented. So there's a popular test called the Myers-Briggs test, borrowing some of the concepts from Jung's theory and measuring people's degree of involvement with these four functions. You should Google it sometime. It's quite interesting. But our personality is made up of more than just the four functions. We also have the two attitudes. Think, what's another word for attitude? Well, when I think of attitude, I think of outlook. So we're talking about views. And there are two major outlooks or two major views. He called this extroversion and introversion. Extroversion refers to looking outside of ourselves. Introversion is in reference to things that are within. If you go back to my little definition of personality when I talked about Freud, I said personality is that signature style way of how we relate to our internal and external worlds. Well, here we have it from Jung, the internal and the external. Introversion speaks to the internal world. Extroversion speaks to the external world. Now, we're all in touch with our inner realities, things like our thoughts, our concerns, our feelings, and our external realities, situations, events, and people. Students typically get the mistake that a person is either an introvert or an extrovert. That's not true. Well, not true to Jung's theory. And Jung is the first one to discuss these ideas. He said we all have a certain degree of extroversion. We all have a certain degree of introversion. And that combination makes up the person. I'm a bit more introverted than I am extroverted. I'm capable of going both ways here, but I spend a little bit more time internally oriented than externally oriented. And you probably hear the term an extrovert. Oh, I'm an extrovert. I get along with people. I love being around all the the noise and the people and the fun. Well, yeah, you have that capacity, and maybe you prefer viewing things externally. It doesn't mean you don't have it within to introspect and look internally. So, what is personality? Jung said it's a combination of the four functions, the two attitudes, and a sense of consciousness and unconsciousness. Now, Jung was actually a protege of Freud's, and they had a falling out, I think, in 1913, and Jung went his own way. Freud was very proud of Jung. He thought he was going to carry the torch further into psychodynamic theory. But Jung had different ideas, and even though he agreed that there is a personal unconscious, that we have these unconscious motives and thoughts based on our own personal experiences, in other words, we personally develop an ego, and he agreed with Freud's ideas, but he said that the ego was limited and that the ego did not serve the purpose that Freud believed it to be. Freud basically thought our minds repress things in the unconscious to protect us and defend us, whereas Jung said our egos actually select things from the unconscious. Interesting. So we have a sense of personal unconscious, but a greater contribution is the collective unconscious. Something that is very different from what Freud had ever said. Now, Freud said that we all have a personal unconscious. We all have our own personal ego, and Jung went along with that. But apart from something that we experience on the individual level, all of us, as members of the same race, the human race, experience what Jung calls the collective unconscious. We have unconscious motives and thoughts based on a collective experience of being members of the same species. And he referred to this as archetypes. Quite technically, archetypes are tendencies to form ideas. And there are certain types of ideas you see across all cultures, across all histories, that we all have recurring ideas based on certain motifs or symbols. Now, these motifs or these symbols are probably culturally specific, or they are culturally specific. They're expressed very uniquely, but the gist of these ideas are the same, and you see them throughout history. Now, some examples of archetypes I have on the screen: the animus, anima, and the shadow. There are others that Jung has identified, looking across the humanities and the arts and written expositions across the world. You're going to see certain types of motifs surface in these cultures, like the animus. The animus speaks to masculine qualities. Now, masculinity might be expressed differently in different parts of the world across different periods of time, but it's pointing to the same thing. So we have this archetype or this tendency to formulate ideas with a masculine style to it, or the anima, the feminine. All cultures have some understanding of feminine qualities. We have the shadow. The shadow speaks to the very dark side of human nature. All of us have a very dark place from within, a capacity to do great evil. So what is personality? Personality is a combination of these things, and Jung referred to it as the self. A combination of these attributes, influences from the collective experience, the collective unconscious, through the archetypes, something that we all share as members of the same race, the human race. What we get from the personal experience, from the ego, and that's a matter of personal conscious and unconscious, in addition to the attitudes of extroversion and introversion and the four functions of the mind, create unique combinations. And a healthy personality is one who could embrace these different facets. And Jung was one of the first to say individuals vary to the extent that they engage in these attitudes and functions, and where they've been personally with respect to their ego and the influence of the collective unconscious. So individuation is the key. You don't want to deny these attributes. That would be dividing away or cutting off certain things. For example, when I was a young boy, my stepfather told me that young men sit a certain way, that young men aren't supposed to cross their legs over their knees because that's what women do. So I found myself early in life liking to cross my legs, I guess, like women do. But, I was forbidden to do that because that's not what, quote, men do in society. So sometimes we get weird messages, we get social influences, or maybe religious interpretations that might threaten the healthy personality, that might get us to deny true attributions of ourselves. Okay, so that's Jung in a nutshell. Moving on, we're going to finish talking about Gordon Allport. He is one of the first trait theorists of personality. Now, I teach a personality course here in the fall, Psych 215. Consider signing up for it. And we go over a number of trait theorists. But it was at this time, in the late 30s, that some psychologists who were looking at personality kind of got away from these models of personality like the ones I discussed with Rogers and Freud and Jung, and they were making a paradigm shift in that personality could be understood by looking at various traits. So go ahead and read this definition I have on the screen. It's a mouthful, but you could break it down. Alport believed that personality is dynamic. So this is something that is active. It's a catalyst. It's a dynamic organization, meaning it got structured at some point in time. It's within the person based on what he calls psychophysical systems. In other words, they're probably related to brain behavior. But personality is something that determines one's characteristic behavior and thought. So personality is not a product. Like Freud said, we develop a personality. Alport says personality determines our characteristics, our behaviors, and our thoughts. So personality is determined to some extent from the past, in that it is structured by the past. But contrary to other theorists, Alport said that personality is predisposing of the future. So we're going to carry ourselves and we're going to show ourselves consistently based on our leaning toward future events. And personality is characteristic. It's highly characteristic. It's unique for each individual. So I'll use the term later, idiothetic, that Gordon Alport uses or takes an idiothetic approach in that, like there are no two fingerprints that are the same, there are no two personalities that are the same. And we can distinguish these based on traits. Now, Alport said that personality is initially structured from infancy through adolescence. So that's pretty similar to what Freud was saying. And he says that we develop across these stages in relation to what he calls the proprium, in that not just from infancy through adolescence are we leaning toward the future events and we're striving to take on new challenges, but in the first maybe 16 years in life, this sets the personality structure, but personality continues to evolve and change. It's very dynamic throughout our life. It's not crystallized and fully developed. It's ongoing, sort of in relation to what Rogers thought personality was. So I mentioned the word traits. Traits are not physical attributes. We're talking about things that inform our behaviors. We're talking about tendencies or predispositions to respond in certain ways. Now, Alport didn't give much detail, but he basically nodded his head and he said, well, we get these traits ultimately from neuropsychic structures. In other words, our traits are manifestations of brain activity. Now, we didn't really understand neurological functioning that well, but about 15, 20 years later, another theorist by the name of Hans Eysenck did some research demonstrating that there are indeed some connections between activities in the brain and certain traits. So we have these traits. Some of them are common. In other words, these are things that we all kind of share within a culture. But when you look at specific combinations of traits, now we're talking about personal dispositions. So personal dispositions consist of traits, but very unique personal traits that distinguish a person from another person. So we all share traits, but we don't have the same personal dispositions. Now we're talking about that like fingerprint-like quality in our display of traits. Alport believed that in terms of our personal predispositions, some of us have what he calls cardinal traits. Go ahead and write this down. Cardinal traits are very powerful. They strongly determine our behavior, and we see them in just about everything we do. Now, not everybody has cardinal traits. But for some people, that is the case. Think about the President of the United States. Can you think of a cardinal trait that he demonstrates in every news conference? I mean, he carries himself in a way, and I don't know how you would define that one trait that is all pervasive, but I see it. Just like the former president, Barack Obama. If there's one trait I could think of that he shows across all his behaviors, I think that would be civil. He's nice, he's civil, he's polite everywhere he goes. Okay, so some of us might have cardinal traits, but all of us have a small host of traits that he calls central traits. These are things that influence, not determine our behavior, but they have a great influence on what we do. Our behavior is determined by many things. How we express that behavior is a matter of our traits. And the average person has somewhere between 5 to 10 central traits that are specific to that person. And lastly, there are secondary traits. So there are many types of secondary traits, but these are not displayed in every behavior. These are things that are more context specific. They vary with respect to the situation that is at hand. So maybe I have a set of central traits that show across all behaviors, across all situations, but then the situation might call for me to display a secondary trait, and maybe it's very appropriate to that situation. So we all have access to these secondary traits that we don't show all the time, but we show them only when the situation calls for it. So personal dispositions consist of these three things: the cardinal traits, central traits, and secondary traits. And when you think about it, these combinations create a very signature style way of behaving, or how one behaves. In other words, it's idiographic. It is specific to the individual. So there cannot be two personalities that are the same according to this model. Allport believed that personality is highly individualistic, and that we should get away from categorizing people as having this personality type or that personality type, like some of his predecessors believe. Okay, that is it for this lecture on personality, and have a good day or evening.